Hello, everybody. This is Jade with the Octopus Literary Podcast, and a happy belated Valentine's Day to you all. And as a belated Valentine's Day gift, we are bringing you coverage of chapters 13, 14, and 15 of John Scalzi's Old Man's War. That's right, this week's episode is brought to you by True Love, or at least what appears to be true love, but is actually a very scary lady who is going to throw you and your puny little walking cane across a room and re-break some of your ribs. So, let's get started. So chapter 13 opens up with John waking up, and he's got a breathing tube down his neck, and he's generally just really half a man at the moment. He's completely incapable of communicating in any way other than through his brain pal, and most of his body was basically completely destroyed. I will say that I was completely wrong about what I predicted last week, which was that John's body would be completely unrecoverable and he would have to get a new one. But not only is his body able to be recovered by basically bathing in nanobots, but he also doesn't lose his left arm, as I thought, and he does actually keep his wedding ring. So everything I said last week, in the last 5 minutes or so, just chuck it out the window. Also, everything I said last week about the woman who John thinks is his wife, chuck that out the window too. But we'll get to that. For now, the Dr. Fiorina tells him that he is above Phoenix, and if you remember, Phoenix is the central hub of the CDF, right? This is the headquarters of the human military force. So he's effectively been shipped all the way back home because he's so close to dead that there's really no other option. He's also not going to be fighting for the foreseeable future. Overall, he breaks pretty much every bone in his body, especially those below his rib cage. And overall, the doctor explains to him that he would have been completely unsalvageable if it weren't for the fact that he is a CDF soldier and has an extremely technologically advanced body. And that all of his squad mates are dead. In fact, everyone from his ship is dead. Everybody. So John, before he asks about his squad mates, he asks about his wife. He says that he saw Kathy on when he was rescued, and that she's been dead for years. And Dr. Fiorina, for his credit, actually appears to not know about the nature of the special forces and is not actually lying to John. He genuinely tries to help him and make him understand that it was probably a hallucination. So the doctor puts John in what appears to be a medically induced coma for the next several days so that his body can reconstruct enough for him to actually be able to have conversations and stuff, which he is completely incapable of doing right now. But when he wakes up, John sees Harry. And this section is really nice because the last section was super intense. I was pretty much yelling at the camera. There's a lot. We lose 4 of the old farts. There's a lot of emotions. There's a lot of violence and death. But this one chapter where John is just kind of laying in a bed and hanging out with Harry and Jessie is kind of like a nice park bench to sit on before the finale. We're closing in on the end of the book, and I have no doubt that the end of this book is going to be intense, both in a violent way and in an emotional way. So this pleasant sort of regroup with the characters we started out with is necessary to give the audience a break, but also to sort of reset and make us remember who these people are outside of battle, effectively. So in this conversation, we catch back up with Harry and Jessie, and we find out that they were their shuttle was the only shuttle that survived off of their ship, the Hampton Roads. And 62 battalion strength cruisers with full crews went down, with a total of 95,000 people who were casualties in this attack. So this is incredibly violent. this is on the scale of what the humans did to the Wade last week. Um, but we, I wish we knew what kind of scale the CDF has so we can know just how much this hurt them. But either way, 95,000 people is a huge number of people. That's 5 times the number of people who live in my hometown. The humans cannot sit idly by. They have been attacked in such a way that they have to retaliate and they have to prevent this from happening again. So Harry tells John that he will be interrogated by some CDF investigators who are coming in to try to just get every iota of information that they can out of the situation. And John asks, what are they like? And Harry says, humorless. In other words, we have established this symbol of humor as being aligned with John and humorlessness as being aligned with the CDF the whole book. So when Lieutenant Colonel Newman and his companion Major Javna are humorless, we see them as sort of in opposition to John almost immediately, even if subconsciously. But also on a conscious level, they are very accusatory of John from the get-go. They want to know why he survived and everybody else from his ship died. They imply heavily that he is a spy who is working for the Ray. And as we know later, and as most people probably at least suspect, they're doing this just to rule out all options. But it really gets a rise out of John. Especially after he makes a couple of things that could barely be considered jokes, and they get very, very irritated with him. One of the ways that they actually rule out that John is a spy is by accusing him of, well, they say that it's an interesting string of coincidences that he happened to live. And John says, the hell I do. I gave the order after the Modesto was hit. My pilot had the training and the presence of mind to get us to Coral. Excuse me if we were well trained, sir. So John gets really mad here. And this is just a fun beat because in real life interrogations, one of the methods that they use to see if somebody is lying is if you accuse somebody of something, if somebody gets mad, they are probably innocent. But if somebody gets defensive and afraid, it's usually because they think that there's something they need to be afraid of, or that they're lying, effectively. So this was good and accurate writing, at least as far as I, a layman, know. He, in fact, gets so angry with them that the two interrogators are actually taken aback. The two interrogators actually get much more suspicious with him when he regurgitates the information that Alan gave him last chapter about how skip drives work. And I must apologize to our good departed friend Alan. I called his lecture on skip drives frustratingly off topic and pointless last week. But as it turns out, this is going to be very important for the rest of this book, and I should have never doubted him. However, it does make John look pretty bad here. But eventually he's able to convince them that he only knows this stuff because Alan told him. And it becomes apparent that knowledge and understanding of skip drives is actually going to matter as we reach the climax of this book. So after John is interrogated by the CDF interrogators, he meets back up with Harry and Jesse, and he starts telling them that he saw Kathy when he was rescued. And he starts insisting to her, my wife is dead, but this was her. It wasn't Kathy as she was back when we were married. She was a CDF soldier, green skin and all. And this is the point where you, the audience, are supposed to start thinking that he might not have been hallucinating. Because the first time you're like, yeah, this is definitely a hallucination when he actually sees her. And the second time, he's talking to his doctor while he's still very delirious, and his doctor dismisses him. But the third time, he is awake, alert, walking around. He just got out of a very stressful interrogation. And in general, we trust John's perspective. He's a very perceptive person. So this is the bit where you start wondering if something is really going on here. Harry gives his token, maybe you were hallucinating, that I think anybody would give. But after just a few sentences, he begins to start putting together some dots that make it look like the special forces are not all that they seem. At this point, Harry says, maybe it's something else. They call them ghost brigades after all. I think I'm going to go do some digging. If I don't come back, avenge my death. And at this point, I set the book down and I started thinking really hard. And this is actually where I figured out what the ghost brigades are. I was really proud of myself. And that is why you guys should also do these incredibly deep dives into books, so that you too can predict massive plot twists 2 pages before they happen. So at his next interrogation session, John asks if he can send a letter to the Special Forces unit that saved his life. And he receives, pushback, obviously. But he pushes pretty hard, and we actually get a little bit of information from how hard he's pushing. And at this point, it's pretty apparent that John cares a lot more about figuring out what is going on with this mystery woman than anything that just happened with the Ray. The Ray being the aliens that just killed 95,000 of their people. So then we cut back to Harry, and Harry tells John that he's been trying to find information on the Special Forces, and he can't find anything. Harry's been pushing just as hard as John has, to anybody and everybody, but he's only really able to gather rumors and stuff like that. But there's basically no official information that exists. What he is able to glean is that, so it appears that people who sign up for the CDF and they send in their little DNA sample and they're all ready to go. So the CDF starts making a clone of them, and then they die. The bodies that are left over go to the Ghost Brigades. John remembers that he heard this when Leon Deek died. So apparently the medical technician knew about it. So it's not so secret that nobody knows. It's just so secret that nobody is willing to tell you. So Harry, Jesse, and John get into an interesting philosophical discussion about whether it's okay to be using a clone of somebody who's dead. But they don't get super deep into this because effectively the rest of this book is a question of, is it okay to use a clone of somebody who's dead? And largely, the CDF can only really get away with this because the recruits are never supposed to know about it. The Ghost Brigades are kept as far away from the normal troops as possible. Also, apparently, some of the Special Forces units are just ridiculously experimented on and combined with a bunch of other alien species to the point that they're not recognizably members of the human species anymore, which seems like it would be something that's normal for the actual Special Forces, but to regular recruits, it would be quite disturbing. So at this point, you may be still thinking, and I was kind of 50% thinking this too, that John is hallucinating this person who looks like Kathy, and you just feel really sorry for him. And you understand that he's really lonely, especially because he just lost Alan, his only consistent friend. So subconsciously or consciously, in the back of your mind, you're remembering that Jessie is back. Remember how I said Jessie is a red herring? Jessie is a red herring again. She was the first person that John had sex with after he got a new body. But here, we find out that her and Harry are together. And it just kind of beats in how alone John is. He's got two friends in the whole wide world, but they're together, and they get to be together all the time because they're on the same ship. John has no one whom he can share a close one-on-one friendship with anymore. This Kathy lookalike is the only option he has, and it's quite sad. And that's when Jane shows up. So Harry sees someone standing in line for a hamburger, and it's Kathy. And John describes this as getting dunked directly into a vat of ice. So, going into chapter 14, I want you to remember that this is effectively the only thing that John has been thinking about for the last week or so. A lot of that past week, he has been lying in a hospital bed, unable to do anything. So when Harry asks what John is going to say to her, and John says, "I'm going to tell her thanks for saving my life," there was never any possibility that that was the only thing that John was going to say. When Jessie tells him, "Whatever you're expecting out of this encounter, you're not going to get it," John says, "I'm not expecting anything." That cannot possibly be true. One, he's been stewing on this for like a week. And two, he has a lifetime of expectations built up for what Kathy acts like. And no matter what Jane does in this conversation, it will defy John's expectations unless she has Kathy's exact mannerisms and memories. Jessie and Harry's credit, they do their best to make John go in with tempered expectations and a rational mind. It doesn't work, but yeah. So John approaches the Kathy lookalike as she is sitting with a group of other ghosts, and she doesn't recognize him at all. So at first he starts out pretty easy by telling her that she rescued him on Coral, and she reacts about as mildly as a person reasonably would react to this situation. She thinks it's pretty neat that he lived, and that's nice. But that's about it. She comments that she thought he was going to die, and he says that I had something to live for. Now, I went back and reread that section because I didn't think he had anything to live for, and he didn't. In fact, in the section where John is bleeding to death and he sees Jane here, he welcomes death. When he says, "I had something to live for," he's talking about now. He has something to live for now, which is the hope that he may be able to have a conversation with somebody who resembles his wife again. So she introduces herself as Jane Sagan. I gave up on trying to not use her name in advance. So John very smoothly is able to send Jane a photo of their wedding. And she loses it. It says, "She moved fast, faster than even normal CDF, grabbed me and slammed me against a nearby bulkhead. I was pretty sure I felt one of my newly repaired ribs crack." So one of the things that this kind of does is it completely defies whatever expectations John or any of us had going into this conversation. Because whatever personality Kathy had, which we don't really know about yet, she probably did not throw John across the room on a consistent basis. Typically. However, even in the middle of this commotion, and the fact that John has just rebroken some of his bones, he is able to squeeze out what he wants to say, which is, it's my wedding photo. The woman in the picture is my wife, Kathy. She died before she could enlist. They took her DNA and used it to make you. Part of her is in you. Part of you is in that picture. Part of what you are gave me this. I held up my left hand and showed her my wedding ring, my only remaining earthly possession. And so this is a huge shock to Jane, obviously. But telling her is the right thing. There's a very serious secret that's being kept from her, and she does need to know it. But that is not at all John's motivation. He's not trying to bring anything to light for the good of the Ghost Brigades. The first sentence of this book is, on my 75th birthday, I visited my wife's grave. This is before the sentence, then I joined the military. This book is about a man who misses his wife very dearly. And he is also in the army. But at every step of the way, this book, it has taken a back seat to his love for Kathy. The only time we really see his military life come through is when there's nothing about Kathy that can possibly be going on. Now that she's back in the story, or in his story, keeping up appearances by not approaching some random lady or getting into a fight with her in the middle of the cafeteria, John probably doesn't care at all. He has his priorities, and it's Kathy, really long distance, everything else. So Harry and Jesse come to John's rescue, and Jane stalks off. After she tells him to stay the fuck away from me from now on, the next time I see you, you're going to wish I'd left you for dead. Which, honestly, not that surprising, given the situation. And a guy named Lieutenant Tagore approaches John and tells him to just stay away from the special forces. Stop asking questions. Stop trying things. Just leave Jane alone. Harry and Jesse take John back to the hospital, where he has to get retreated for the exact same injuries he just had. However, John is woken up by Jane. She appears in his hospital room, and she apologizes for throwing him across the room. Now, later in this chapter, John will describe Jane as being a person with low emotional intelligence. He doesn't think that she's very good at managing her own emotions or understanding complex emotional situations. But I disagree. She comes to him and she says, "I'm sorry about today. It was just unexpected." It takes a very it takes a certain, at least medium level of emotional intelligence to do this. To recognize that you reacted badly because a situation was unexpected and come and apologize. Especially when you don't need to. So, it's not that it's not that Jane has a low emotional intelligence. It's that it's not as high as Kathy's. And John expects Jane to be as emotionally fluent as Kathy was. And she tells John, "Look, I'm not your wife." And even though they just met 5 minutes ago, it comes across as her telling herself, not John. She's obviously quite shaken by knowing that her DNA came from somewhere, and she's trying to solidify her own identity to her, and yeah, to this strange guy she just met, but she's unsure of herself, and by insisting that she's not John's wife, she's trying to regain the identity she had this morning. And remember how I said that people who tell jokes are considered John aligned thematically in this book? Jane tells John a joke by telling him that she's advanced for her age. By the way, she's 6. There's a lot to unpack there. So her telling him a joke is signifying that she is coming around to him. And we can tell that from the context of this scene. But it's very explicit here. So John asks Jane, how does it work? What's it like being 6, not having a past? And she says, I woke up one day and I didn't know where I was or what was going on. But I was already in this body and I already knew how to think. I already knew things. How to speak, how to move, how to think and fight. So the special forces are the antithesis to the regular troops, because we've stated time and time again that the regular troops are defined by the fact that they have grown and aged. They've had experiences with others. They've raised children, something that the special forces can never do. And they're invested in the survival of Earth, something that the special forces have never seen. The special forces are born as adults, so they don't grow physically. They have no new experiences or connections with others. Every day is the same, so they don't grow emotionally. And the CDF sees them as a superior fighting force, and they are. So it's interesting to see where that's going to go. Jane says that some people are a mix of multiple people, or some special forces are a mush of multiple dead people together. I don't think Jane is. Thematically, it is just juicier to have her literally be a clone of Kathy. She obviously has some alien DNA in her, but that's got to be about it. And then Jane asks to have the picture back. She deleted the wedding photo for reasons, but she asks to have it back. And I want to clarify that this isn't some latent memory of Kathy's that Jane has. She's a new person who wants to know about her origins the same way we have a fascination with our own genealogy. But this here shows that she does indeed have a fascination with John as well. And she asks John how much he loved Kathy. When people are married for a long time, maybe they stay together out of habit. And this is just another beat in. Jane may be 6 years old, but she has the emotional intelligence of an adult. Most teenagers are just starting to understand the idea that people who are married for a long time may also have problems. I don't know where Jane got this information, but she understands the human psyche more than John gives her credit for. And then Jane leaves abruptly, and Harry and Jessie are having breakfast with John, and Harry explains his theory for how the Ray are able to see when people are coming into in on script drive. And it turns out that Harry has been asking all kinds of people all kinds of things about the Ray and tachyons and the technology between different races. And he says that there is no way that we aren't going to go back to Coral, or we the humans are not going to go back to Coral and reclaim the planet. And so there's this interesting adage when you're talking about space travel that is, how will you get America to go back to the moon? It's have China go up to the moon and knock over our flag. That is basically the reasoning that they have here. That's not the reasoning they have here, but they're extremely motivated to go after the Ray now. So John goes ahead and tells Harry and Jessie about his encounter with Jane last night. Something that she explicitly told him to never tell anybody. So Harry says an interesting thing about Jane, which is all she knows is fighting and killing. We have a life of memories and experiences to stabilize us. Even younger soldiers in traditional armies have 20 years of experiences. In a real sense, these special forces troops are children warriors. It's ethically borderline. Borderline child soldiers are, nobody likes that. So I noted here that Jane is indeed not the same person as Kathy. In the same way that if you clone a child from the Middle Ages and put them through our school system, they are unlikely to become a rat catcher or a subsistence farmer. Her experiences, when Venn diagrammed against Kathy's, have a zero intersection. John is doing an admirable job treating her as her own person, even though subconsciously he clearly wants her to be Kathy. Harry asks if Kathy ever threw him across the room, and he says there were a couple of times that if she could have, she would have. But, this is after 42 years of marriage. Jane met John yesterday. So it does show a difference in behavior. John is summoned to the Eisenhower module to meet with some higher-ups. So on his way to this meeting, Jane comes up behind him and tells him that whatever this meeting is for, she arranged. So, A, this is another beat of Jane being very interested in John as a person. And B, it appears that Jane is actually fairly high-ranking. Maybe the Special Forces automatically have a higher ranking, but she definitely appears to have a lot of influence over the situation from here on out. So John enters this huge meeting with a bunch of very high-ranking people, one of whom is named General Keegan. And General Keegan is like the third or fourth new high-ranking guy that John meets, and it reinforces this idea that nobody is a constant in John's life, and that he missed Kathy because she was a constant, and now, again, John has no one. So they decide to give him a commendation for his quick thinking when the Modesto and all the other 61 ships were blown up. And John really doesn't like the idea of being commended for this because, everybody he knows died. But I thought it was actually pretty neat because imagine if they didn't. Imagine if all couple thousand other people on his ship died and they just shoved him onto a new ship. And he just had to keep going on like nothing happened. They had to acknowledge it in some way. And it sucks that it didn't mean a lot to John, but nothing would. They tell him that they know that Harry is snooping around, and his attempts to keep it a secret are frankly a little ridiculous. They also tell him that they want him to help out on the Special Forces ship when they go back to fight the Ray again. They say that they think he's very quick thinking, and that he's one of the only people that has fought the Ray and lived. We find out also that this is because he fought the Khonsu and lived in a later scene. So he will be promoted to lieutenant and placed on the bridge of the Sparrowhawk, which is Jane's ship, to give advice and, disperse information as well as disperse any ideas that he may have as to how to defeat them. This is the thing that Jane said to say yes to. And he agrees to it on the condition that Harry and Jessie are transferred to military research. Harry is obviously very good at finding answers, and as far as Jessie goes, she can just basically train for any position in there. But John tells them that he's very afraid of them dying. He's lost everybody he knows. they've obviously lost the rest of the old farts. So they object to the fact that they didn't have to serve the same 2 years as everybody else, but John doesn't. John doesn't take it. Also, Harry being reassigned to military research is better for everybody, including the military. I don't get the impression that Harry is doing a whole lot of sharpshooting. Him getting answers for the CDF about these alien species is probably what's going to help humanity the most. So John has a few hours to gather all of his earthly possessions, which is nothing, by the way. All of it was destroyed on the Modesto, and go over to the Sparrowhawk. And it appears that he's going to be staying here for the foreseeable future. He meets Major Crick when he gets aboard, who explains to him that Major Crick, is one of the oldest special forces at 14. It's much more accomplished than I was at 14, and a lot less annoying. And Crick explains to him that he is going to have a difficult time communicating with the rest of the special forces because they communicate basically at the speed of thought through their brain pals, and it's very difficult for regular humans to keep up with them. They even call them real horns because they may as well be a different species. So John goes back to his new room on the Sparrowhawk, and he finds Jane there, and she tells him that she wants to know more about Kathy. And what's interesting is I want to know more about her motivation here. Is this because she's 6 and she has a very small ability to regulate her emotions? She's a platoon leader, we find out. Is this simply because she has the opportunity to be one of the only Special Forces members who knows anything about her past? I feel like we're going to explore this a lot more, and I'm very interested in what John Scalzi has to say about the nature of clones and personhood here. But John tells her that he has to, if he is going to tell her about Kathy, she has to tell him about herself. He says, the more I know about you, the more I can get used to the idea that you're not her. And I'm really proud of John here. It has to be excruciatingly difficult to force yourself to see this person as somebody who is not your wife. And he is making every single effort to be that good person. Great going, John. So John goes to a meal, I assume it is breakfast, with the Special Forces. They are all very quiet because they only communicate via brain pal. But a group of particularly courageous young ghosts approach John, and they all look very nervous, and they ask if they can sit with him. And it's kind of adorable because they come across as a bunch of little elementary schoolers who want to hang out with the cool teenager. They want to see what the cool teenager is doing. They ask him about what it's like to be a person who is older than their entire squad's ages combined. They ask what it's like to be on Earth and come from and have an actual childhood, something that they don't understand. Hilariously, John says he had no idea what he was getting into when he joined the CDF, and one of them says, "That seems kind of stupid, sir. I don't know why anyone would choose to sign up for something when he really had no idea of what he was getting into." This kid is me. This kid is me every time I've said anything in this podcast. It's hilarious. He's also 3. And John explains that an unmodified person at 75 is a lot more willing to take a leap of faith than you might be. It just goes back to this repeated beat that John joined the CDF because he was desperate and lonely. And his loneliness hasn't really gotten better since joining the CDF. He was very happy with the old farts, but they were only together for like 3 days. And that's why he's willing to risk his neck for Jesse and Harry, and it's also why he's risking everything to maybe connect with this Jane person. It's also why he's susceptible to groupthink in the last section, and he just wants to be part of the club because he's very lonely. But that's beside the point. So it takes quite a bit of effort, like a couple pages of conversation, for John to get through to the special forces, but he does. And they ask him why he fights for the Earthlings, well, people still on Earth, and he says, because they're human and because I said I would. At least that's why I did at the start. Now I don't fight for the colonists. I mean, I do, but when it comes down to it, I fight, or did fight, for my platoon and my squad. I looked out for them and they looked out for me. I fought because doing any less would have been letting them down. And one of the special forces says, that's why we fight too, sir. That's one thing that makes us all human together. That's good to know. So this is the power of John as an empathetic protagonist. There is this group of special forces who has been completely unable to relate to regular humans for the last however long they've existed. It appears to be about 14 years. But John is able to bridge that gap by talking to them, finding things that they can and can't relate to, finding ways to make them understand what he means. John goes to a planning meeting for the meeting with the Ray, which is actually going to be a meeting with the Kansu. So I was right. The Kansu are coming back. Basically, the Ray could not possibly have had the technology that they did at the time, given the technology that they've had previously, and the humans figure out that it must be that they've gotten the technology from the Kansu, who are the only very technologically advanced species that the Ray know. They mention that those bastards have a white dwarf yoked to the wheel. I had to read this a couple times because I didn't know what they meant, but I remembered the Kansu are literally like drinking a star to power their military and all of their battleships. So they just dwarf everybody else technologically. What's interesting is, so they start talking about the Kansu's drive by religion, and I thought this was really neat because in most media, particularly sci-fi, the religious species is depicted as the backcountry rednecks who are still struggling with the wheel, whereas in this case, they are the big bad guys, but they make everybody else's technology look like children's toys. And it's just an interesting take on the religious zealot antagonist in a sci-fi story that I don't think I've seen before. John figures out that the Kansu probably gave the Ray the actual device and then maybe some like instruction manuals so that it would take the Ray a couple of years to actually figure out how the technology works, the technology to see where the colonial ships will be skipping to. So he figures out that it could take a few years for them to actually be able to replicate the technology, which is enough time for the humans to kick their ass and take their technology away from them. This is another instance of John's empathy and ability to simulate people psychologically that allows him to have the military advantage. It's a very slight spin on his repeated empathy that allows him to be an incredible tactical mind. Well, assuming he's right and this goes well. They also tell him that the Kansu actually really respect him because he has the blood of 8,433 Kansu on his hands since he disseminated that program. So that's pretty neat. At some point, At some point in this conversation, Jane sends him a brain pal message that says, "Trust me," and he nods to somebody else with the understanding that she will see him nodding. And I just wanted to point out that they've known each other for about 24 hours and have spoken 50 words to each other each, and they're already communicating telepathically. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to know where this is going. So it turns out that they're going to be going into this contest where each species sends 5 delegates, and they pick. Well, they send 15 delegates, and then they pick 5 delegates to fight each other one-on-one. Whichever species wins gets to ask a question, and I guess they're assuming that the Kansu will answer truthfully. And they're going to be sending 15 Special Forces units and John as their leader, as the respective one. So, and Crick actually says that he doesn't think that any of the Special Forces actually have a chance of getting killed, which seems like hubris, and I hope Crick comes out of this okay. But more importantly, I hope Jane comes out of this okay, because for the next section to be the climax of the book, Jane has to be one of the people that fights the Kansu. And we have to see how John reacts to this in a military situation. So after this conversation, John has 43 hours to get ready for this contest. And it says, during those 43 hours, Jane learned about Kathy. Jane would pop into where I was, listen, and disappear, off to tend to her duties. It was a strange way to share a life. This is very specific phrasing. John refers to being married to Kathy over and over again as sharing a life with her. He has tried his best to not consider Jane to just be Kathy, but he considers this to be an evolution of, or an iteration of, sharing life with Kathy. So Kathy asks him repeatedly to tell me about her, quote. The first story we get is how they met. Apparently they met in the first grade. Most people's first memories are after the first grade. So John probably literally can't remember a time in his life when he didn't know Kathy. And that goes a long way to explaining why he at no point in his life could conceive of living without her. Even now. But also we find out that he cheated on her and she cheated on him, and they still managed to get back together, or find a way to stay together, rather. It says, despite the affair, I loved her and she loved me. We worked it out because we wanted to be together. Also, they met when Kathy was 6 and now Jane is 6. They called this out though, so it's just a coincidence. It turns out that John, they became close when Kathy was asked to play Juliet in the school play, and John got very jealous that she was saying the lines of Juliet to some strange dude named Jeff Green, who was definitely not John Perry, and he got really jealous and started acting out, and then one of Kathy's friends approaches John and tells him that if I didn't go out there and tell Kathy I was in love with her, she'd find a shovel and beat me to death with it. For one, saying find a shovel and beat me to death with it is very John Scalzi. Like, sentences like that have shown up in a lot of places here. But also, this is just how middle schoolers speak, and it's kind of hilarious. So it turns out that John goes to Kathy in middle school and recites a portion of Romeo and Juliet to her, and that was when they first kissed, and she was 15 and he was 16, And it's just exactly what every 15 and 16-year-old basically wants out of the beginning of a relationship. And at this point, Jane asks, "Tell me how she died," just before the skip to Kansu space. And this, I think, is foreshadowing that Jane is going to be in mortal peril as they get to Kansu space. So John explains the "where the hell did I put the vanilla" scene in a lot more detail, and it is much more emotionally charged now. We've seen the deaths of four of the old farts, but most readers don't care about most of the old farts, if any of them. They are all quite shallow, but we do care about John, and seeing him describe how he watches the different functions of Kathy's body shut down is just awful. And he says that he told her that he loved her over and over again until she died. Because he wanted that to be the last thing that she ever heard. So Jane says, "What is it like when you lose someone you love? You die too, and you wait around for your body to catch up." He explains that he's just living a different life now, not that he has been resurrected in any way. And after this, they sit quietly, waiting to be in Kansu space. It says, "We sat there quietly, fading in with the silence of the rest of the ship." So John is becoming part of the Special Forces. And that's the end of chapter 15. Overall, definitely the best section of this book so far. There was a lot that happened here, and it just felt so much more relevant than a lot of the things we've been doing. We had a whole section about the old farts, but none of them particularly stood out. And I don't think any of them particularly stood out to John either, in relation to Jane. This whole section was about Jane, and it definitely feels like we're tying up the end of this book with some very interesting questions that I'm very excited to read the end of. So this week's discussion question is, would you be okay with somebody cloning you after you died? And what would you be okay with your clone doing? So yeah, see you next week.